Yeah, we'll continue on our program towards the last speaker of this session. Okay. Who is John Millar, representing Aalto University, but also the band tonight, I guess. And he's going to play for us tonight later on. But nevertheless, and then he brought another instrument. So this was kind of it was interesting to note when I got the proposals that there were these two especially who were kind of instrument oriented, and then there were the rest of the proposals that I got were basically more in orientation towards the kind of a philosophical questions in broad terms. But the two other actually had to cancel. One of them didn't got the visa from Iran in time, and the other one broke his leg. So that was a kind of a drag there while I was planning this event. But nevertheless, it's my pleasure to welcome John on the stage, and yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Should I speak? No. Is that one of these?
That's actually for your foot.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
I think in this space I don't need.
All right.
Yeah. We're both engineers too. I get this. The reason this was a bit strange, but because Nefes got this gig tonight, which is tied up with the symposium and also the Etnosoi festival, there was a link given to me by Jonja, the singer from Nefes, which had a call for abstracts for this symposium. And this life has been rather diverse. It's involved quite a number of different elements: music, engineering, meditation, three main things. And it just seemed like an abstract just wrote itself. Then to my dismay in a way, Antti Ville accepted the abstract, so I have to turn up with some sort of paper. I have to say right away, I'm not an academic in this area at all. I guess I can be called an academic engineer if that's not an oxymoron. I do research on power systems and energy systems and stuff like that, and similar to the problem you have with your departments at Helsinki and University, we've had the same sort of shifts. It's now the Aalto University School of Electrical Engineering, Department of Electrical Engineering and Automation. That's where I'm working. I just took 4 terms, and there could be a bit of controversy here, and I do not want to offend anybody. I've grown up in New Zealand. In New Zealand we have just about every religion represented. We don't have any religion that dominates. So that's led me to certain conclusions. I don't take any of them that seriously, but I treat them all with a lot of respect. But that just gives a bit of the background from here. We're all very much coloured from the kind of background we have, what we're brought up into. And I was brought up into a country of rugby, racing and beer drinking probably, but also with a bit of music there, which saved the story for me. So, I have to mention the sponsors because this work has been done under the auspices of a project which is called the Tuli Project. Although I'm mostly a power engineer, about half of my research time in the last 2 or 3 years has been to develop working life tools in our education. So we're facing, I think in the West, a bit of an existential meltdown. We get a lot of research saying that the workplace is going to be unrecognizable. Within 20 years, 40% of the jobs are going to disappear and that kind of stuff. So the part of the work that I'm most, if you like, concretely involved in is embedding working life skills in the normal courses that we teach in a master's program, which is on automation and electrical engineering. But being in a program like that, I start thinking, well, the world, there's always been change. We're in a period of great change. Whatever we're educating students to do now might not be valid for what they're going to find in the workplace. And so that makes me want to look a little bit more deeply, and educating students to have first principles, some fundamental knowledge, the ability to analyse, to solve problems, the basic theory in the various fields, but also have the ability to be able to embrace challenges and change, because typically in engineering it's been around now for at least 100 years in the form it is now, and people are sort of it's a fairly vocational kind of education. People are trained to do a certain job. You can almost smell what kind of engineer, or whether somebody's an engineering student as opposed to a humanities student or whatever. And we've got to sort of really break out of those kind of straitjackets, I think, going into the future. It's challenging times we've got. Oh yeah, and one major theme, and this is to do with the knows self. Although there are all these entities, I appreciate them all, but they're all devoid of any self-existence whatsoever. And some of these things I'm going to come out with can be treated as hypothetical, so I'm not trying to sell anything, I'm just trying to stir things up a bit. More of that later. I come from New Zealand, so I do things round the wrong way. That's the fourth term, the nace flute, but I've brought that in first. This, of course, is a very famous, or the beginning of a very famous epistle or writing by Mevlana Jalaluddin Rumi, The Song of the Reed. It has very powerful imagery, and I guess you can read. So that's the first few lines of a rather large work. Sorry? Oh, microphone, thank you. Yes. So I've taken care of the last term, the nace flute first, but there are two terms before we get to the main term, secular and experientially. So I'd like to just clarify what I mean by those, because I know I'm in the company of experts on semantics and all sorts of things, and I'll get shot down if I don't explain the terms that I'm using. So in the context of this presentation, secular, I'm meaning that which can be empirically verified, not requiring any supernatural belief system. That's a fairly specific meaning, obviously. Again, anything that I assert in this presentation should be taken as hypothetical, which can be falsified. If you can challenge it, don't worry. It's just something being put out, although what I'm putting out is mostly very old. There's nothing very new about it. I'll try to avoid putting cultural spin on the raw experiencing that we're trying to point to in this presentation, but of course that's a vain effort because we're all conditioned and we all put our own colouring onto things. And then finally there are the more official meanings for secular. Often it's trying to keep religion out of the state, or it's trying to keep spiritual stuff away from physical stuff. Especially the former of those is quite an issue these days, with a couple of states at least. But that's what I'd like it to be just looked at, something that can be experienced, empirically measured, or experienced in the here and now. Just to illustrate this, conventionally, we can say, I'm holding a pen, it's got a certain weight, I'm feeling its weight, I can do things with it. I can hear a sound when I'm tapping it on the table. There's a kind of a subject and an object. But if we go more deeply into this, just into the direct experiencing of what this is, there's feeling, there's hearing, there may be doing, This is getting closer to what the mystical experience is about, I guess. It's about being with the processing. The separations tend to disappear. There's speaking. But we can get into the midst of this experiencing where things like I and the object become conceptions. They're conventional conceptions, but the direct experiencing is just experiencing. There's differentiation, but there's a kind of connectivity or a unity amongst everything. And if this is followed further, often in the meditation experience, you might melt into something that's just described in these terms of these rather cliche New Agey type words like beingness, isness, the emptiness that is fullness, the fullness that is empty, effortless effort. The point where less becomes more, or even the letting go of that. So experiencing, I'm talking about just conventional experiencing right through to what might be called the experiencing in a meditative experience or in a flow experience. And secular, what can be experienced, either measured or at least subjectively experienced. I realise there are problematic problems with these kind of definitions, but then we get to the term Islam, and I like to just stress again that this is only hypothetical, it's opinion. It's a non-Muslim, a non-believer trying to understand. I mention also this background of mine, the country I come from. So I make this equation, Islam equals surrender to reality. This has got a kind of a humorous background to it. When you're somebody who has no professed belief system, every now and then evangelical types have a go at you. And usually these are Christians, and sometimes they're Muslims. I must say my interaction with Muslims has been far more beautiful and interesting than my interaction with Christian evangelists. I used to play music on the street, and I was a sitting duck for every kind of... I think one day I had 5 different types of Christian trying to convert me, each of whom had the true path and the only path and that kind of stuff. Anyway, I know at the workplace a couple of years ago there was a colleague or a student, a doctoral student, who came up to me and was asking, well, what do I believe? And I said, well, I believe the sun comes up, I believe the next breath will come. Until it doesn't, I've got sort of live at that level, but I don't really live with too much more than that. And he tried to, well, he pushed the idea of Islam giving a poor guy like me with no meaning in life some sense of meaning or some purpose or some sort of reason to live. I didn't feel I needed it. I still don't, but anyway. And so he asked, had I thought about Islam? I said, what does Islam mean? Or I may have pushed the thing, does Islam mean surrender to Allah? He said, yes. So I said, is Allah reality? That was a little bit uncomfortable. Is Allah not real? That was more uncomfortable. We agree with Allah as reality. So then I say, surrender to reality. Of course, that's a bit tongue-in-cheek. It's quite profound at some level. But it's also very pretentious. It's problematic, of course, because the word Islam, I think, is an old Arabic word that predates actually Muhammad, that means surrender. I could be corrected if I'm wrong on this. But of course it's been associated for the last 1,500 years with one of the major world religions, and so taking a kind of secular meaning on that term is probably just a bit silly. The other issue is that the term reality might throw off some of the religious spin, but it's likely to be academically extremely contentious. What reality am I talking about? Am I talking about atomic reality, a molecular reality, a cellular reality, a spiritual reality, a physical reality? Whose reality? So I'm not doing very well with this first term. And then going even further, an equation, surrender to reality, is as pretentious as it is likely to be offensive. Switching context, if I would really be able to surrender to reality, then I would be a living Buddha, for example, and that's definitely not the case. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement to say, I surrender to reality, really. I let go of everything and surrender to reality. And that's the profundity, I think, that's in Sufism and in the mystical end of all the religions. But the best I can say is I aspire to surrender to reality. And the problem there is that we've now got two contentious terms, at least from the point of view where I stand. The surrender of a supposed entity I to some conditioned concept of what reality might be, and probably isn't. So much for the first term. Faith. So challenging, but faith, or the proclivity for faith, it seems to be more or less hardwired in the majority of humanity. Wherever we've manifested, there's been some belief system. Here's a bit of a loose coverage of, and I'm not an academic in this area, of course, I've just done general reading, but there seem to be some explanatory theories as to why this might be, especially tying it to evolution theory. So faith evolved to aid group cooperation and cohesion. There's quite good evidence that without something that unifies us, we can only really usefully socialise or group maybe with 100 to 150 people. And then beyond that, divisions occur, factions occur, things don't work. But if we have an abstract concept, a kind of cosmic stick and carrot, something that gives meaning, we can group together as much larger groups of people, and that's been useful. Faith stems from an evolutionary advantage that has been hijacked, that's a question. The projection of agency, when we're walking in the forest and we hear a noise, we project the idea that could be a living entity that might harm us. That's been useful. It gets us into the fight-flight mechanism quicker. We're more likely to survive if we actually imbue, because I'm thinking of early belief systems, shamanistic systems, where the whole of nature was more or less living, and there were gods and fairies and what have you there. It was a useful idea because it made us more prepared to react more quickly to dangerous situations. It's an aid to survival and reproduction, because if we have the idea that we've got an afterlife, we've got a rebirth or reincarnation or heaven or whatever, then it might give, when times are pretty tough, still a reason to go on and actually to reproduce. And then there's this faith in authority. It seems when we're born, we're fairly useless. Our brains aren't fully developed because our heads wouldn't fit through the birth canal. So when we're born, we wouldn't get far if we had to learn everything by experience. Most other mammals and animals are more or less hardwired ready. I've seen cows giving birth to calves. They fall on the ground, then they shake themselves, and then they're up and they're sort of on their wobbly legs, and they find the place to get the milk, and they sort of start working fairly functionally. I think if we didn't have help, we wouldn't find the mother's breast, probably. So this means that it's been advantageous that we will listen to people in authority. First, our parents, so we don't go out we don't walk into or crawl into a fire, and then into the figures that our parents, for example, invest authority in: the shaman, the witch doctor, the priest. So those are just some sort of explanation. That could be all wrong, but I mean, that's the way I'm trying to sort of understand some of these things. We can argue, of course, interminably about our various beliefs, philosophies, worldviews, but I like to bring this thing, and I'm calling myself a curly-haired Kiwi idiot. I actually had a haircut yesterday, so the hair's not so obviously curly, but normally it's pretty out of control. Wants to investigate who is the I that believes, argues, acts, thinks, feels, sees, hears, etc. And wouldn't that be a very pertinent question to open? And of course, sages and people over the centuries and millennia have done just that. So the next term is no self. I'd better explain what this means. Clearly there's a mind-body here, and clearly it's useful to have a name on it. Clearly symbols and names and language have been very useful for us, but it seems they've carried possibly, I mean, this is a theory, that since we developed symbols and language, we've developed a kind of separation. We've taken those symbols and symbols to be entities in themselves, in a sense. So the idea of self, what I'm talking about is the idea that there's some kind of entity, maybe behind the eyes or in the heart or in the belly. It's a very nebulous sense of self. I mean, if you go into when you are looking at the subject. It's sometimes here, it's sometimes here, it's sometimes a web, it's sometimes a full body experience. But the idea there's some entity that's controlling what's going on here. That's what's being held up for question. There is a bit of academic and pseudo-academic research done on this, of course. Some of you might be aware of the evolutionary biologist work, quite a famous atheist actually, Richard Dawkins, who wrote a book in the 70s called The Selfish Gene, which is a bit unfortunate because it implies agency, that the genes are somehow got some sort of ambition in life. And the other thing here is Susan Blackmore's The Meme Machine, and in fact, memetics was coined by Richard Dawkins at the end of this book, The Selfish Gene. And that's talking about, it's tied up with something like cultural evolution. A meme is anything that can be copied. And the idea is that once we got vertical and our big brains developed, we learn by copying. And anything that can be copied is a meme. And the idea is that since this development, gradually, ideas, philosophies, belief systems, advertising jingles, all this kind of stuff gets transferred, almost like a virus. And it's, in some ways, working against the, shall we say, the trajectory of the genes, or of genetic evolution. So to some extent. Now, memetics seems to have fallen out of fashion, or maybe was never really in fashion. The problem is genetics has got DNA, it's got some sort of physical thing you can talk about. Memetics doesn't. Maybe neural imaging and so on will come up that there are certain brain or neural sequences that respond to the way an idea gets transferred from one human to another. But that's been one main criticism of it. It's kind of it's more like an analogy, and it's applying evolution ideas, perhaps out of context. But anyway, it's interesting that either of these theories, and in fact Susan Blackmore's theory is that there's no need or place for a self. It's written quite clearly in her book. Mentioned that already. It's useful to have labels, it's useful to have some handle for these relatively autonomous subtotalities, which we are, and that's coining a phrase from David Bohm, who was a physicist. And it's an understandable conundrum. We have the spatial, temporal, transient form that seems to have a certain autonomy, so it's understandable that we might get the idea that there's something in here that's controlling everything. There's a bit of a warning, there are no half measures with this, because what we're pointing to is no self practice, meditation, in Sufi terms, a total surrender. It's very important to start with what's closer than our hands and feet. I could take on an idea that there's no self entity in any of you and then start abusing you because, well, there's no self-entity there or not. I mean, this is actually there are quite serious risks with this kind of practice. It can be abused. It's pretty strong medicine. So what I'm meaning by no self-realization, I'm meaning letting go, just as in shrugging off the belief in a self. The idea that there's an interior entity that's controlling the show. This is because, at least for me, it logically seems unnecessary. It can't be found when looking. I've been meditating for about 30 years. Because experientially, viscerally, it's such a relief and liberating to let go of unnecessary baggage, but it's only a first step. If you like, in meditation, it doesn't mean that you've got nothing else to work out or resolve, but it's a fairly useful first step. Or at least that's a kind of hypothesis. The last term, the nave flute, it's representing the seeker yearning for reunion with the beloved, Allah. This is experiential and it's problematic for many, but it's to do with surrender. The idea is that when this bit of reed is chopped from the bamboo grove, where it's in unity, it's suffering, and this play playing the nay is the kind of plaintive call for reunification. It's the sort of, it expresses the yearning we have to be reunited with the divine. At least that's one symbology. Anyway, it's experiential. There are many dualistic workarounds, so we could say that the theistic religions are dualistic. There's usually a heaven and hell, there's good and bad, there's a creation and a created. There are non-dualistic teachings that tend to stem from Buddhism and the combination of Buddhism and Taoism that turned into the Chan and Zen Buddhist schools, for example. But there are, even Christian mystics have used analogies like the mystical union is like when you put a hot bit of metal into a fire and it becomes red hot. You can't sort of differentiate the heat from the metal that's being heated. So that's what I call a dualistic workaround to try and explain a unity experience. Okay, getting to the thing that's paying for the research I'm doing at the moment. Even if we can engineer our way out of the present global supply-demand imbalance, at some time we must face the fact that unchecked consumption and trashing of natural resources at a greater rate than they can be replenished is materially unsustainable, is demonstrably a path to suffering, and will require much deeper human development and transformation than engineering alone can deliver. And the pedagogical implications of this are considered. So just very quickly, the motivation is, well, look at the state of the world, even without looking at the result of the last US election. Worn-out models are not really up to the tasks at hand. Economic models that equate neurotic overconsumption with a healthy economy are inherently flawed. This is opinion, of course, you can disagree with it, but this is how I see things. Fortunately, overconsumption is not a recipe for happiness, but old habits die hard. And then there's this talk of this fourth industrial revolution and an increasing rate of change in our societies. So the pedagogical applications, if you like, I'm taking away the word innovations because these things are quite old concepts really, but perhaps in this context it might be looked at as innovative. If one can surrender to an abstract concept or to living reality, one can presumably surrender to the task at hand if it has meaning. So teachers need to provide meaning and context or encourage students to find it, and that's well known. If we can activate students, they're going to be far more, they're going to learn much better than if we're just preaching to them. And if there's a meaningful task at hand, mindfulness and letting go of selfing are great tools to dissolving, transforming or burning hindrances, and then reassessing the task, whether the task is indeed meaningful. Often students, human beings, make up their mind very early in life what they're good at. I don't like maths, I'm not going to touch it, or I like this, I don't like that. You're in a job or you're in the workplace and there's something that's unpleasant. These kind of tools allow you to look within and really find out what is your reaction, has it got any real basis? And if we're talking about mindfulness and this letting go, more or less the clearing happens. It just happens. It's a kind of natural process. Now, maybe if you find that, okay, here I am, I've removed my own hindrances, but this doesn't really feel good that I'm making a weapon of mass destruction or something like that, then you might find out that, well, actually the job that you thought had meaning doesn't have meaning, and it might cause a major shift in the life. So it's a kind of it's not saying that you'll clear everything so you can do anything. You might see more clearly and then decide that what you're doing is not very wholesome or helpful. Faith, well, the way I look at faith is build up a toolkit of what tends to work. That's a kind of faith. You try something, it's scientific method. You have a hypothesis, seems reasonable, seems to explain the facts, you try it out. Does it deliver? So build up a toolkit for what tends to work, be honest about what doesn't work, cultivate faith, if I can say that, and mindfulness, and letting go if they work. Be playfully aware of our conditioned gullibility. Watch out for skepticism becoming cynicism. The no-self stuff, this is a pretty radical transformation. It changes everything, and in a way it changes nothing. and I have to just mention, this is mentioned so sort of briefly here, but if there's nothing in it for a me, because there's no me, it doesn't deny what is. It's not the same as nihilism or fatalism. It's just the empty, well, that's getting a bit cliched. The experience is sobering. If you really look into the selfing, and you look into it enough times, this might just sound stupid. You might say, hey, there is me here. Well, just relax, open, go into it. The bigger the defense, usually the less there is behind it. And this isn't getting rid of something that was there. It's letting go of a belief in something that wasn't there. That's what the suggestion is here. So it's not nihilism, it's not sort of denying something, it's not exercising something, it's just going into what's happening and letting go of what's not happening. The fear of failure tends to lose its grip, although again, old habits die hard, so I was pretty late putting this presentation together, and that's an old habit. I wasn't afraid about consequences. I probably could talk for too long without any PowerPoint. This may be a tricky transition if this thing happens to you, but it's as if everything is falling into place, and falling is quite a common description. And the way I manage my working day is I write a list of the things that would be good to do, and I just do them. Because it doesn't really matter whether I'm doing them or not, but if I'm being paid to do things, well then it's good to write them down to remind myself what should be done and just do them. So we're getting to the end of this, and there's another analogy with a hollow bamboo that I very much like. I don't know if you've come across this. There are references for everything that's in this presentation. This is the song of Mahamudra. It was given by Tilopa to Naropa. They were both Indians, but Naropa, at least so the story goes, is one of the Indians that were one of the transmissions of Buddhism to Tibet. So apparently one of the students of Naropa was Marpa, I think the guy's name was, who set up the Karmakaju or the Vajrayana tradition in Tibetan Buddhism. This was given from Naropa's teacher to Tilopa to Naropa, and this is just the part that's to do with the hollow bamboo. So do naught with the body but relax. Become silent, empty your mind. Like a hollow bamboo, rest at ease your body, giving not nor taking, put your mind at rest. Mahamudra is like a mind that clings to naught. I'm not trying to sell some new thing called Mahamudra. It just means the great gesture or the great symbol or what is beyond symbols. It's a particular strand of teaching in the Tibetan tradition. So that's it. There's a list of references, the kind of general reading that I've been doing, and also probably will try and put together a paper from this. In fact, the paper's been written, but I don't know where to send it. And these are references that are more general. So, thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah, right. I think we, I don't know where exactly are we now, but
Probably.
a bit late, but that doesn't matter. We can extend the next session a bit. But all right. Anybody else, or anybody have any comments at this point?
Don't be afraid. There's a lot of contentious stuff here, and that's fine.
Yeah, so just, okay, you're asked what is reality, who is reality? I think that just comment. There is no reality in itself. There is reality in its context. So we have to focus on some of the reality that people claim that this is kind of reality. I mean, there are so many reality in the world. Just comment.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. What I would talk about of the meditative experiences or the religious or whatever experiencing that you want to talk about, what I've noticed in my own practice is that they're very non-verbal. You could say they're very primal, very universal, but very quickly coming out of them, in comes the ego, and starts putting it in the context that the way of explanation that that you're most familiar with, and so that's a sort of a patterning that's become actually, watching that mechanism has been more interesting than the actual experiences in recent years and the practice I do. So I think there is an experiencing beyond words and symbols, and but what we put on them. I was traveling. I was quite nomadic for many years, and I met with Christian mystics, Sufi mystics. I spent one winter a lot of the time in Konya, sitting with the Dervish community there. I've spent a lot of time with Buddhists. If I explain a meditative experience to any of these, they'll put it into their context and give So it's I think you're right. One has to at least be very aware of the context and realize that it's affecting how we view things.
All right, Jonas?
I would recommend that you find an anthropologist called Deborah Katchen, who writes on Sufism in Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
She has some really speculative and interesting ideas where she uses sound in the double meaning of sound. Sound as healthy and sound as sound.
Mm-hmm.
To talk about Sufi practices in a way that was touched upon earlier by Mika, saying that you can go from the sound in the tongue to basically a sound that has spread in your body, and you don't need to make that sound because your body is sound. And she has a lot of interesting ideas that I guess that from what
I could add to this list.
you could definitely develop on what she's into, and she has an enormous amount of writing. Deborah Katchen.
Deborah Katchen. Okay, I'll probably get you to write that down later. Thanks very much. That echoes, in the Buddhist tradition, mantras are often used that way. They're out loud, and then they become interior. So I saw a lot of parallels in that as well. Yeah, great.
Yeah, in my mind, it also resonated with this kind of paradigm, what they call the new materialism, which I don't know if Deborah belongs to this kind of feminist strand of new materialists, but still the idea, as you said, that experience. Although the basic idea, I guess, there is that experience is never just purely, or it cannot never reduced in a verbal expression, or even a symbolic expression. That it's always material in different forms, and the kind of I guess it's a question of basic epistemology in a sense that what do we know world through kind of which sensory responses and how to be in the world, and the idea that even if is it logocentric in a sense that we have to use these words all the time to label things, and to a certain point or to a certain extent they are useful, as you mentioned, but still that they do not, with them we cannot grasp the kind of original or the experience of the feeling or the experiencing of let's say singing or playing or whatever. But still there is kind of usefulness to label it in a certain way. But then there are these also and how to, especially in the academic context, how to sort of go beyond that and work with the limits of the verbal kind of meaning-making system that we have to in a sense use, and try to convey something that is inconveyable, and then try to be sensible about that. But it also, but you mentioned, I wasn't quite sure, there was this, you mentioned there was this one note regarding meditation, I took it, that it cannot be found when looking. I think that you were referring to the self. Am I correct? But I was just wondering if looking there, it sort of rang a bell in my mind, or this kind of a warning bell about the risks of visual epistemology, in the sense that are we looking? In which way are we looking? Are we looking for, or are we looking with our eyes?
No. Sorry, this is looking just as an investigating, exactly. Opening to sort of. It's
but it sort of proves the point in a sense.
Yes.
There are risks in using language when we try to make sense of this. Okay. Anything more? Yeah, Jonas?
I can just read from her last email when she made a call for a paper here. Sensory ethnography and the Anthropocene, which is basically anthropology, but taking humans as a part of the planet and ecology, or human ecology into Anthropocene, they use that. New methods for new environments. The author in the panel explores new methodologies for an ethnography of the Anthropocene, including different sensate ways of knowing and being with milieu in the midst of rapid change. Curious alike.
I don't know if the project will fund me to go and listen to that. Probably it's using language that's way beyond me, but yeah, interesting. There's a lot going on all fronts, and on this no self business too. There's a lot of neurological research, and and as far as meditation and spiritual experiences, there are people that are having fMRI scans at the same time they're meditating, and there's all that kind of stuff going on. That's part of the empirical thing that I'd be.
All right. Thank you again, and thank you all.
Thank you.
And just a reminder, if you want the free tickets to the concert, just come over and tell me your name, so I will include them in the list.